Welcome, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to what will be the fourth installment in our awesome series with the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, where we've been dissecting the ins and outs of radical right extremism, as well as really diving into the mechanisms and how we combat it. And next up in our talks here, we have the awesome Dr. Mario Peucker, and he is a senior research fellow at Victoria University and fellow at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right. So how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you, Ahmed?
Doing pretty well, my brother. So thanks for joining us. And I just want to dive right in. So, as a leading expert here on, online and offline mobilization, and you were the co-editor of the first academic book on the radical right in Australia in the 21st century. So that's pretty large accomplishment. And so you have a pretty unique insight into radical right extremism, especially in Australia. So let's just start with you telling our viewers a little bit about your background and your work.
Okay, so I'm Mario. I've been working as a I guess sociologist, social science researcher since probably around 2003. As you can tell, I'm not originally Australian. So I started my I wouldn't say career, but my work as a social scientist in Germany, 2003, working on broadly sort of inclusion exclusion dynamics that was links to racism, links to hate crime, but there was always also an element of monitoring the extreme right in Germany at a time when the discussion around the extreme right was very different, at least in Germany, and I think also around the world. I still work sort of in that broader space of inclusion exclusion. But the last probably 7 or 8 years, that was also the time in Australia, I've become more interested in forms of the question how people express or enact their citizenship in a broad sense, and especially when they do it in a way that is a bit on the edge of what we see in society, a bit fringe, a bit sort of counter hegemonic expressions of citizenship that doesn't sit well with probably mainstream societies, and that covers a whole range of things. So I've worked on the way how on Muslim community activism, and that has nothing to do with political violence or anything. So I have to probably emphasize that just how you enact your citizenship along different parameters in a way, religious parameters that is in a secular society quite controversial sometimes. And also how basically people express their dissent, their anger, angry citizenship. I think there's a lot of space for that, and there should be space for that. And that's where I then moved back into the analysis of or the examination of radical right, far right movements, because where do we draw the line between angry white men and political violence or an inclination to violence? And I think that line is quite fascinating for me to draw. So that's where I am now. And that the last 4 or 5 years, we've done quite a lot of research in Australia. And the only reason why I could be, as you said before, the co-author or the co-editor of the first book was because there wasn't much. It's not that I was particularly early. Australian academia was particularly late to the game, basically. That's why it was not a major achievement, but it was still something.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something because I'm not sure if our viewers are very familiar with what's gone on in Australia, but I'm interested in knowing is it because the academia was kind of behind, or is it also that was there a radical right phenomenon that was being missed by academics before you dove in there? Was there or was it kind of relatively not as, of course, intense as it is in other parts of the world? How do you see that?
Yeah, there has been a right-wing extremism has been around for a long time, but it hasn't reached in Australia, but it hasn't reached that level of public resonance in a way. So it has not been the way that, when I look back in Germany after the wall came down in the 90s, it was quite, the skinheads walk. there were pockets, have been pockets. Has been a Nazi movement during the second or just after the Second World War in Australia. So there have always been issues, and we should not forget that Australia is built on, and that's a controversial thing, but it's becoming more, acceptable to say that now in parts of academia at least. Australia was built on the concept of white supremacy, basically. I mean, it was a black country and it was declared an empty land, and then white people came and basically said, this is ours now, and black people are not considered, human in a way. So it was based on that. And then similar to Canada, there was a white Australia policy into the 60s for the basically defining Australia as a white place. And that sort of distracted, I guess, academics from looking at the extremist manifestations in a political sense. But also it was less manifest than in other countries. So that has changed in the mid-2010s, probably.
Yeah, I mean, as we saw, that changed for us too in the late, mid-2010s. Because the thing is, it's similar to the U.S. in the way that, upon its founding, there was a lot of, there were some white supremacist principles in there. And of course, obviously, the founder story is complicated, and I do think that, the democracy they set up was brilliant, et cetera. But obviously, so when you have countries and nations that are founded upon those kind of principles, and the oppression of subjugation of other people, then you kind of see these manifestations pop up throughout history, as we're seeing, now with pretty much across Europe and in the U.S. at a wild rate, given what Trump has done. So definitely interesting. So I mean, I know that there was a recent study that was done on community-driven extremism at Victoria University. So could you just tell us a little bit more about that? Because I know the community aspect of this is really, and at the local level, is important. We talk a lot about online extremism. So
that's right. It's true that we've done a study before that looked at online, and we realized that there's a lot of work going on, scraping data from social media pages, and it's important work. I don't want to discredit that at all. I mean, I was one of them as well, but I mean, others can do that probably better than I do. But I just thought that there's something missing if you just stare at posts. And I thought with our team at VU, Victoria University, that it would be worth, trying a different approach and looking at how right-wing, far-right mobilization has played out in local contexts. Because since 2015, Australia has seen an enormous rise in street mobilization, and we thought this is worth investigating. And we looked at not only what happened there, and what was happening while we were doing it, but we also wanted to understand why certain communities respond in a certain way to that radical right mobilization, whereas in other local contexts there was no response. So what are the factors that make a community more vulnerable to or susceptible to this mobilization? Why did they join that movement in one community, in one municipality, but not in another? So it was actually then in the end, it was more about looking at structural and individual identity related factors that make people sort of protect them against those mobilization drivers, or make them more vulnerable to fall into the trap.
I mean, it's really interesting because, I mean, like you said, we normally talk about online extremism. We're talking a lot about kind of suppressing posts and how these various communities will organize on Telegram or different extremist platforms. We talk a lot about that with Ashton Kingdon here on this series. So I think that's definitely really important because actually Ashton mentioned this too. She was saying, we're trying to do online solutions to offline problems because a lot of the times, like you said, you can target specific communities, localities with different radical right messaging, and it doesn't appeal the same way to each community. Some it doesn't resonate with one, might resonate with the other. So what are some of the factors that you're seeing contributing to making a community more susceptible to radicalization?
Maybe I should just add one comment that, there's no dichotomy between online and offline. People don't. It's not this or the other. I mean, it's inherently intertwined, and when people, they are, I'm in the offline world, but I'm talking to you in sort of, there's no, but I mean, there are certain specifics for the online and the offline, and that study just looked specifically on the into the local factors in the physical world. One factor that we found is that mobilized people in one local context to stand up against the far-right mobilization was a very strong sense of local pride. So I mean, people feel proud about being from that local area, and when people come in and protest against something that, against a mosque or whatever it was in that instance, people felt that this was sort of a stain on their community, and they didn't want that. And it took a while until that kicked in, and then with a few other factors coming into play, they turned it around very quickly. So it all of a sudden, before a certain point in time, you could not talk about the mosque in a positive way because you would get bullied on the street. So there was a strong climate there. It was dominated by a small but loud sort of minority within that community. And only when the civil society stood up against it and changed the climate. And all of a sudden, it has changed within just a few months. It has changed from that extreme to the extreme where those people who were critical of Islam or the mosque or outspoken Islamophobes, they felt then that they were silenced and they couldn't talk about it anymore. So local pride was a very important factor. And why do people have a pride in locality? I mean, that's a long history, the history of the place, but also the social connections in your environment, in your neighborhood. There was one study done, not by us, but in the UK, where they analyzed leaked membership documents from the British Nationalist Party, like a pretty full-on right-wing party, like far-right party. And they looked where these people who were members of that party, where they lived. And they found that many, or quite a large proportion of them, lived in areas that were both diverse, but the diversity, like ethnically diverse, but the diversity was also segregated. So they lived in their own little white bubbles next to a very diverse neighborhood. So there is a sort of those urban planning, urban structures, and the spatial questions play a very important role in vulnerabilities, because you see the other as a threat, but you don't engage with the other, and the combination of both make you more vulnerable. So what I found really fascinating is that those spatial questions really played a very important role that seemed so almost random. I mean, where you live, and even commuting to work. Do you work where you live? Do you develop a certain, do you identify with your local space?
Yeah.
Or do you just live there and you don't have time to go out because you work too hard and you spend time in, commuting back and forth? All these little things played a really important role.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So, I mean, when it comes to the local pride, you were saying essentially the community kind of mobilized against the radical right extremism that was trying to push, Islamophobia, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's kind of interesting because, it shows like that when there's connectivity within like you said, that wasn't really there wasn't like any government or, programmatic interventions there, right? That was a community driven kind of counter extremism situation.
Yeah, because the government becomes obviously part of the problem. In that case, it was the local council, the local government, who was seen as being complicit, with Muslim community, and so they lost all credibility in significant parts of the local community. So if the council or the local government had done something, it wouldn't have gone down very well, because people wouldn't have, there was so much animosity towards the council. And I think on a broader national scale, we would see a similar thing if we only see a push against far-right ideologies from the the Washington elite in the US context, or the Canberra elite. It wouldn't. I mean, it can be part of the response, but it wouldn't be sufficient. I think the key, and Australia hasn't been very good at that, is mobilizing really the local community. Pride is something that this emotion of being being respected, being taken seriously, and some people are driven into the arms of far right groups because they don't get that sense of respect anymore. And there's good work in the US done by strangers in your own homeland, in your own land, where people feel this is my land, but I don't feel like this is my land in my home anymore. Losing a sense of I worked my whole life, I worked so hard in order to be rewarded for that in some ways, and all of a sudden, because of economic structural labor market changes, all of a sudden I don't, there's no upward mobility anymore, and people look down at just because I don't have a college degree, people look down at me, and I'm not what the hell's going on?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
then there's this search for belonging, for respect, for recognition, and I mean they find that in some groups clearly.
Yeah, because like on the flip side, like it's you'll see like you said, there's that community that kind of combated the extremism from taking place, running rampant in their town. But then on the flip side, there is the community-driven extremism in which there's like, let's say on the flip side, there's like that town that, let's say you're proud of this white small town, right? And then suddenly, like you said, your factory shuts down, or you lose economic mobility, and then suddenly there's an influx of immigrants that happen to come around at that time, and then suddenly they start to be blamed and scapegoated for a lot of these problems. So it's one of those, you're seeing those dynamics as well.
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly the point where sort of structural socioeconomic factors interplay with cultural change. And sometimes that happens very slowly, and then people move on and get used to the new environment. But often it happens very quickly. When we look at the refugee crisis in Europe, for example, when was it? 5-6 years ago? That triggered a lot of what we see now in the radical right in Europe, because it happened very rapidly, and it has become a mobilization point for the far right around the world. Look at Europe, what happens to Europe if you open the gates, sort of thing, and then it gets connected to white replacement theory and narratives and all this stuff. But we I think what we haven't been very good at is recognizing and understanding these grievances that come from those rapid transformations, instead of just saying, well, you're a bad person because you're racist. I mean, I'm obviously not saying you're not a bad person, but
of course, yeah.
It doesn't take us anywhere if we just moralize and judge people without trying to understand where it's coming from. I mean, it's a human instinct. I have that too. But if we want to make progress in terms of combating those developments, then we can't stop at judging people. We just have to understand the grievances and where they come from.
Exactly. And I think when it comes to that specifically, I know that before, some people, the argument against that in the US would have been during the Trump era, early Trump days, when people were saying it was economic anxiety that was driving a lot of the Trump effect, when obviously it was racism. But of course, like you said, there are driving factors behind the racism, which can include economic anxiety and displacement. And one of the reasons why some people are, in the US, are definitely wary of that thinking about that, because we see a lot of, like in the insurrection, there was so many rich people that took, like, we had the real estate agent took a jet to the insurrection, like, like there were people, so there were like rich people coming through to like fight for the last gasp of the Confederacy. So like in the US, it's weird dynamics, because we're seeing like this, kind of all oligarchy in a sense, where there's like a racist, it's like in Russia, right, where there's like a clearly white nationalist kind of rich sector, right? But at the same time, there are those who they're preying upon. There are those whose fears and those people who we like. I like to try to separate in my mind, especially given all that's happened, like the difference between the separating the perpetrators of these racist narratives and the leaders from those who are falling victim to them. Obviously, the insurrectionists and those I put in a different category. But like, let's say you're just someone who's at your house in a small town and you're consuming Tucker Carlson. Like, I blame Tucker Carlson, not the person. I blame because they might just be going through something, and that's why Biden won, right? Because Biden kept talking to the issues. Biden kept saying, look, and Trump started talking about Hunter Biden and nonsense. So that's why he lost. But Biden was talking about, hey, these are the economic issues I want to solve. And then Trump was just saying, just blame these imaginary brown people that are in your town that you haven't even seen a lot of the time. So
I think it's really important that we acknowledge that there is economic hardship that can lead to grievances, but it's not the economic hardship itself, I would say, but it's how people emotionally respond to that and what they. So I mean, sometimes you hear that, the next, who is vulnerable? It's the working class, the uneducated, and it's very easy to brush it off by saying, oh, they are uneducated. But I think that's really missing the point. First of all, empirical evidence doesn't confirm that, and we know it's not the unemployed. It's those who are particularly vulnerable. I mean, obviously, it's a very diverse group. Anyone could be in the far right in terms of his socioeconomic or her socioeconomic status, but it's more likely for someone who has a sense and feels that his previous rights or his status in society is diminishing. It is still a high, white people in Australia have still a very powerful status, same in other countries, obviously, very powerful status. But the feeling of relative decrease there's something happening, they feel.
Yeah.
That I don't get the respect, I don't have the status. I've never been for gay marriage. All of a sudden, we have gay marriage. I've never been, where's the church? Now everyone is an atheist. There's something that people feel. Many people feel this, have the sense that the power is moving away from them. The enormous power that they used to have, like white vulnerability, or fragility, as it has been called. It's not very constructive to call someone, to just call it white fragility. It is basically describing that sense of losing control over your world. And this is where you then look for respect and recognition elsewhere. And conspiracy theories are one of the outlets. If you don't want to join a group, then you just believe in having found the ultimate truth, because that also gives you control and power again. At least you feel like that. And so I just wanted to say that it's not necessarily a correlation with your actual socioeconomic status. That's
exactly. It's about the reaction to it. No, sorry, I didn't. Yeah, I was like kind of finishing your sentence. Sorry. It was like the reaction to it. Like you said, it's not necessarily what's happening, but how you process that. And like we saw that essentially during the pandemic, with these vast amounts of people just kind of capitulating to their situation and really just diving into rabbit holes of QAnon conspiracy theories and kind of like trying to hold on to anything because their world was falling apart. And some people process it that way, and others were constructive. Like I know a lot of people who had struggles, but they're all right, like they maybe invested in themselves, or they read, or they kind of, it's also a mental health thing as well. If you're not, there's all these other factors at play. But also I think what it comes down to is, like I always point to the leaders, right? If there was not a Fox News or right-wing media presence in the US that was just lying to them, like people they're freaked out, right? Like there's always conspiracy theorists. There's always going to be people who try to look for, who are cynical and think that the government and these scientists and, experts and all these rich people are out to destroy them. But if there wasn't a media apparatus feeding those lies that they're telling themselves, there would be less extremism. So, like you're saying, like there's these economic factors at play, because like, let's say you lose your job and then you're wondering why, and then Tucker Carlson and Fox News and Trump tells you it's the brown people down the street, it's the
Yeah.
Latinos that work at your local restaurant that are taking your job,
Yeah.
then you're gonna think that. So it's one of those things where it's like, how do we prevent? That's why the community driven approaches are so important, because if you have pride in your area, or if it's mobilizing the community's members with themselves, they can help kind of stem the
Yeah.
flow of these lies and get other people to recognize that they're just being misled to believe that's why one of my approaches, or we tried to here at Rantt Now, and of course with you
Yeah,
and
that's
folks at
right.
CARR, is that like we can't just yelling, calling people racist is not productive anymore. Obviously, I think we have to call out we have to call things what they are and don't shy around the truth. White supremacy is white supremacy. Extremists are extremists. But when we're trying to reach people and pull them out, I think what you're saying is very important. We need to do these approaches in a way that doesn't patronize and tries to show them the truth.
Yeah.
And you see that as a community, local mobilizing communities is a way to do that, right?
Well, I mean, if someone who, I mean, it is, it's the question of who do these people listen to? Would they listen to someone who comes with the moralizing thing and said it's bad to be? I mean, getting out of those movements is not, doesn't lead, or it doesn't start with discussing or telling them that they are wrong, because it's also often not the reason why people enter into those groups and movements, because they are adamant about white supremacy. I mean, that comes then, and they're probably open to that, but that's not why you join a right-wing militia or whatever group you join. That's not why you join the base or whoever the group is. There's something else, there's a need for something, a social need, a psychological need.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, there's no way that, I mean, you can be a white supremacist and not join a group like this. You can be a racist. There are so many racists in the country, in Australia and everywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
But they're not all joining far-right groups. So there is something else. And if you want to get people out of it, it's not by telling them that their way of thinking is wrong. It's by filling the gaps that they were trying to fill, and telling them that maybe the far-right group that they're engaging with does not really sustainably fill that gap in their hearts or in their lives or whatever it is.
Yeah,
and that's a step where you can get them to listen and to engage with you. If you just come along and say you're a bad racist, that's not gonna help.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because I mean, like you said, there are a lot of racists, but not all join groups, and we kind of saw this issue with ISIS recruitment too. It always starts with, it's the same dynamics that get these people to join these extremist groups. They feel disillusioned. They're a lot of these people are just young, incel men a lot of the time, and they're looking for community. From what we found, for what we see, and it's that community aspect, that trying to fill that void, or whatever void they're feeling internally. And it's really trying to find a way to make sure that you can kind of halt that, or kind of like interject, because it's one of those things because last with Sean, we were talking about these community driven approaches, and he mentioned that one of the people in the Prevent program, there was this young kid who believed the Holocaust never happened. It was just falling down neo-Nazi rabbit holes, and was taken to the Holocaust Museum and then met a Holocaust survivor, right? And then it just kind of changed him. So it's kind of like also showing these people that not only does this group not fill the void, this group isn't actually looking out for your best interests, number one. And also, number two, that they're just feeding you lies. But it's like, that's the last point. I'm obsessed with trying to figure out how to tell people the truth without calling them stupid. Like, it's so hard. It's so hard to not to tell people look, you've been lied to. This is the truth, without making them feel stupid. And that's science is something I'm trying to break down, but haven't figured out.
Because it's we hope to think we live in a sort of in a world of reason where you can argue and there are facts, but it's actually, I think it's not like that. That's I thought that this would be the one with the better argument wins, and the one with the better facts. But if you have sort of and this alternative truth, you know, has become a big, I mean, the internet helps with that. Trump helped with it, like the alternative truth. Well, I did not even know that there is something like an alternative truth. I thought that's the beauty of truth, that there's only one.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's not about knowledge and facts and things like that. It's about what they mean to you and what you do with them. So if someone believes in the New World Order, they can see the world through that lens and everything makes sense. And there's no way I could tell them that it doesn't, because just by trying to tell a person that this is all you know, constructed rubbish, then they just believe it even more, because they think I'm brainwashed into telling them that. So it's not tackling those things in a rational. I mean, in some instances that's the right approach, but in some instances it's counterproductive.
Exactly.
I think that's an interesting point, and I just wanted to mention, I know that there is in the terrorism and violent extremism research community, there's a lot of discussion. And what I'm going to say is probably a bit of a fringe view, but I'm very reluctant to compare jihadist, and I'm not an expert on that, jihadist Islamist extremism or ISIS inspired with right-wing extremism. I think what you said before, that there are social factors and grievances and you know, void, and I think that's true, but then the similarities start to end almost. And I think there's a big difference in when you talk about what grievances actually mean to a, you know, just as an example, for a white bloke who has been for generations in power, and now he feels grievances because he, you know, there's a bit of diminishing of his white privilege in a way, if I can use the, you know, that big term, white privilege. There's a difference. There's still grievances, and we have to acknowledge that, but it's a different kind of grievance, as if you're a Palestinian in these days living in the US, being harassed and abused on a daily basis, being you know, with your headscarf being that's a different kind of grievance, and we have to acknowledge the differences too. And you know, a fringe Muslim group that might be, you know, Islamist, political Islamist group, do they have access to power to change really our democracy? Probably not. They don't storm the heart of the American democracy. They don't. There's a different level of power and that's why I think we have to be cautious with drawing. You know, because we are scared of coming up with double standards. I think we need double standards when we talk about different things.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, to be honest, because you know, you know, I've made comparisons myself, mostly around the tactics front, counter extremism front, when it comes to like disrupting ISIS networks online, and when it comes to you know, I've always made these comparisons kind of flippantly without necessarily going to the source of the matter, right? Because what you're referring to is an excellent point. And I think a lot of our viewers would agree that the grievances are entirely different. There's a difference between being someone who's just been historically, you know, oppressed, and then kind of turning to extremism. Obviously, it does not justify the extremism or justify the you know, might justify some extreme views, but doesn't never justifies violence, you know, and never some of the extreme views of, you know, of trying to harm other people or, you know, create, you know, a caliphate or anything like that. But you're right. It's one of those things where you have to look at it differently, because I'm glad you brought up that other point about the fact that this radical right extremism, this white supremacy, is coming from that, like you said, that it's like an erosion of privilege. Like what we're seeing is these white extremists are trying to equate them losing a little bit of privilege to like the grievances felt by people who are, like you said, might be, you know, in Palestine right now getting you know, getting obliterated, right? And obviously it doesn't justify what, you know, I think like, just we don't need to go down that path of that conversation. That'll take forever, but I definitely think Hamas is exploiting that situation, right? Like that's wrong, right?
And I agree with you that there are certain things that are similar, like when you say the tactics, the strategies, but I think too often we then go a bit too far with our equivalences, and we think, oh yeah, it's the same, and then we apply similar approaches to countering it or to combating it or to tackling it. And I think that's particularly problematic if we apply the same sort of strategies. They have to be very, very tailored to the specifics of what we're talking about.
Exactly, because one of the ways to combat, let's say, white supremacy or radical extremism is to tell them the truth, right? But like the truth won't necessarily take someone who's in ISIS off, right? Because the truth of the fact of the matter is that person who's in Syria, the reality of their situation isn't great, right? But like they're telling the truth to a white supremacist, like, hey, you're really just kind of losing a little bit of privilege, or like what I'm saying, or like really, actually, it's just automation that took that factory down, not those immigrants, and it kind of like, because what we're seeing a lot of times is that these, in the white supremacist sphere, like this, like there's of course different levels, right? And also, the comparisons. I'm glad you brought up equivalencies, because we need to also, there's different levels of radical right extremism.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a difference between the Trump supporter that was at the White House rally, and then there's a difference between that person and the person who was crushing the police officer, or the oath keeper walking up in a phalanx into the cap, like, and those who are in those extremist groups. And there's also layers of difference between the extremist groups themselves. There's a difference between those who are in literal terror cells on Telegram that the FBI is watching right now, plotting attacks. And there's a difference between those people and, let's say, someone on the Donald.win, or like someone on some other forum talking about how Trump's just gonna be president again one day. So like there's so many different levels.
That's really important what you're saying. Yeah, I think that's really important that we keep that in mind and adjust our approaches to and also the way we talk. And often media is you write a journal article, a news article. There's not the space for complexities and nuances. You just get your story across. I'm not even critical of those who do that. It's just not the right medium to do that. But if we want to address the problem, that we can't just say, the far right or the radical right, or it's very, very nuanced. And the militia, I mean, where do we even start? Where do we draw the line of what far right actually encompasses?
Exactly, and because it's one of those things where, like, that's why, here's a good chance to plug our partnership, right? Like, that's why we do this, because it's important to elevate researchers in this. I mean, I could go before I partnered with CARR and met Matthew and William, like I could have just wrote a bunch of pieces myself, right? But I don't, there's so many different layers when you have to hear from the researchers themselves. That's why it's so important to publish content from researchers. I don't see a lot of media partnering with radical right experts. They kind of just seem to run their own stories and not necessarily break it down to that level of trying to figure out these nuances. And researchers, I think, do that well, even in articles, because right now, unfortunately, though, there's starting to become a blending, right, where there's like we talked about this in a previous interview as well, where there is this loose coalition almost that we saw at the insurrection, where it's like they had the same plan, like goal, among, like, there's that Trump supporter who's outside the Capitol, who didn't breach it, who's not a member of the Oath Keepers, but who was yelling, "Hang Mike Pence," right? There's those who were just a normal Trump supporter earlier that day, and then now they're at the Capitol cheering on the Oath Keepers, cheering on the Proud Boys, cheering on the anti-government militant.
So it's, and like, even within the Proud Boys, but even within the Proud Boys, there's infighting and struggle of like fundamental ideological disagreements. I mean, when Emilio, whatever his name,
I think it's Enrique,
he gets challenged, and because he is a person of color, we see similar things in the Proud Boys in Australia, where you can see how different even a group that is probably more structured, where you have to sort of tick certain boxes to move up in the hierarchy. I mean, it hardly gets more structured than that. But even within that group, you have different ideological shifts and camps, and it's complicated.
It is, and all of these conversations need to be had in a way to, because we're talking about how do you combat this, right? Like, how do you, there's all of these varying levels, there's all these intricacies, there's all these communities, there's all these factors, when what you've seen in your research and in these localities, and kind of going into these communities that seem to be interconnecting in different ways, what do you think are some of the tactics that could be used not only by the government, but in partnership with NGOs and partnership with these other
Yeah.
organizations to kind of start to combat this extremism?
So I mean, the first step would be any form of leadership recognizing the problem. That's a symbolic but important first step. We didn't see that for a long time, but now we are seeing it in the US, and I'm not sure about Australia. It's sort of on the cusp there. There's investment, like government certainly has to do. There's a space for law enforcement, intelligence, and things like that. We need that. But I wouldn't count too much on that. I mean, that can only be a small part, as you suggested in your question. But then it's from prevention to early intervention. How do we address those grievances when they occur? What do we do with someone, in youth work, social work, parents, families? I think that there's a lot of discussion going on around those people who are close to you and who would recognize changes first. But if they don't know what to look out for, or maybe they know, but they don't know how to respond, then they just tell their kid, don't be a bloody racist. I mean, that doesn't help. You need strategies. And there are a few good programs that also in the US, but also in Australia, that run programs for family, friends, colleagues to interfere. But I mean, youth work and social work is really essential. In that study that you mentioned before, that we did on the local level, there's a youth worker that works for local government run youth group. And then there's a guy who comes in regularly and he says racist things. How do we respond to that? Do we send him away because racism is not welcome here? That's an easy way out. But is that person then going to change their view? Probably not. Yeah. Maybe it gets even worse because he doesn't get, he loses his, he loses that group and then he finds another group. That's exactly what we were saying before, that there's a need for recognition and, for community in a way.
Yeah.
So we have to learn to engage with people who say things that we don't like before they become a political issue and a driver for radicalism. And I mean, I'm not even opposed to radicalism. I mean, being radical is fine. I mean, we should all be a bit more radical in many ways and challenge each other, but have robust, express our dissent, our anger, but in a way that is not questioning sort of the fundamental human dignity that we all have. If we get that across, then we can disagree on many things, like James Baldwin said, we can disagree on many things, but we can't disagree anymore if you basically deny my humanity. I can't remember the exact quote, but along those lines. So dealing with conflict is something that we need to learn. I mean, have you tried to talk to someone who thinks COVID is a hoax? It's painful to have those conversations. But if we don't, then they are going to talk to all the other people that just confirm what that person thinks. I think that might sound a bit off track, but I think that's part of our intervention mechanisms to prevent people, or have an early intervention program there before people slip into the hands of those who just amplify those views and give them a community that is not healthy and that is also for that person not healthy in the long run.
Exactly, because I think you're right on youth work, social work being so important, kind of catching these people early when they start to get these views. Because if you turn them away and say, "Oh, you're not welcome here," because there's an understandable desire to just attack this problem and just push it away and just like I agree. I think on social media you should do that. Right. I think that you push them off social media, but if they're in your space, they're in your community, and there's something going on, like I think it's layered, right? Because as a person, as a Black man myself in America, I'm getting better at it now, but it's hard to, I've had the N-word screamed in my face by a skinhead before. Like it's hard to engage with racists, like it's a lot. And now I preach this myself. I preach what you're preaching as well, trying to engage and trying to understand and because I had to grow to this point, because it was tough, right? Because you try to have these conversations and this person thinks you're less, right? So like it's for Black, people of color in the counter extremism work, trying to do that work themselves. It's seemingly impossible unless you have like meditative skills and you have like self-control. So like, but what I'm trying to say is like your point is right. I think now we have to get to the next stage where, because it's almost more powerful. Like I've been in conversations where, I know a person has clearly bigoted views, and I could see them kind of change while I'm talking to them, because obviously, because like they have so many misconceptions of what a person of color is in their head, that your engagement with them, period, and treating them like a person themselves makes them want to treat you more like a person. It kind of dispels their views. But of course, at the same time, it's not incumbent on Black people to convince, so it's so layered, right?
No, but it shouldn't be it's not the job of people at the receiving end, like to fix that. I mean, that's not what I was trying to say. But if
not you yourself.
To do that, then it's great. But it's everyone's responsibility to not let those statements go unchallenged. Those racist or homophobic or transphobic statements, to speak up and to not just say, it didn't mean it. I mean, it's really important that we deal with those conflicts. And I know that this is different and it's easier for me to say, but structurally, our support systems, our society, our families, are they open to those, robust, sometimes confrontational discussions? Are we willing to do that, or do we just want peace?
Yeah.
And if we want peace, we don't get peace. Maybe for the moment, but it's not going to go away. But when I mentioned how the climate in that regional town in Victoria changed, they might be silent now, but they didn't go away. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, is this what we wanted? I mean, in a way, I understand you just wanted to not be expressed publicly, and there is a lot of. I understand that this can be a goal, that you don't want racism to be expressed. If someone has racist views, that's okay. I mean, as long as he doesn't act upon it and doesn't express it.
Yeah.
I mean, who cares really? I mean, it's bad, but what happens if that racist view, gets amplified and gets channeled into a political group there? Then all of a sudden we have violence.
Yeah.
And that's the risk. That's also a risk that we shouldn't underestimate. That's why I think that mobilizing community. I mean, when we looked with envy at the Black Lives Matter movement, when people of color and white people across the grandmothers, everyone was on the street. This is what I think. This is what is needed, and I think that was an enormously important. Also not only symbolic, but also symbolic for the world to see how people across the spectrum can come together to fight for justice. Basically,
it was a kind of a counter extremism.
Yeah,
movement,
it was.
Aside from the people who weaponized it, the people who tried to then, exploit some of the riots that they saw and then try to say, look at that. Like for the most part, it was a vast re-education on American racism and just racism generally, and how these systems and white supremacy and how these systems perpetuate. So I agree. I think that's excellent. I also wanted to clarify, like I wasn't saying you were saying that at all. I was more or less like, because I know, just for any people of color that were listening, I know that their first reaction or their first thought is, well, how do I do that? Because they're wondering how they can help, and their first thought is like, well, it's hard to engage with those who disagree. But at the same time, I do think it's one of those things where now, like you're saying, in this community engagement aspect, like it takes a coalition, it takes white people to join this fight, and which they have, and for them, and also it's one of those things where I think a big part of this new counter extremism wave and this community focused approach is kind of just really pulling on the Michelle Obama, when they go low, we go high mentality of kind of like, just it's hard. It's really hard work to be understanding and engage with people and be at a level where you can understand their perspectives. But I really think when it's, that's when the most change happens. Like when, like in the civil rights era with that Martin Luther King, I really believe, that philosophy of that's how you change minds. And look what happened at Selma. When you show that you really are when you really are decent good people, and you don't stoop to the other side's level, you elevate yourself, and you end up changing their hearts, you know. And obviously changing hearts and minds is not an easy task. It's difficult to do, but I think it's one of these things where I think if we all just kind of, you know, as an everyday American can do, aside from the kind of actual official programmatic community engagement measures, is to just try to be the best version of themselves, and try not to like buy into these, because at the end of the day, these other races, these other people, a lot of the time are just miserable themselves, and you don't want to. They want you to share in their misery. That's why they're attacking you.
Exactly.
But if you don't buy into it, you might actually end up changing their mind.
Yeah. So, and I'm aware of, you know, my own positionality as being a white person. It's of course it's different, and I acknowledge that, and I don't expect, you know, I don't think that racism is owned by those who experience racism. Racism has to be fixed by those who perpetrate it, and who the white people own racism. We can't just say, you guys have to fix it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
Yeah. I mean, that's great stuff, because these are the kind of conversations that we have, you know, where there's because I know there's a difficulty sometimes for white people to kind of own the privilege that's happened, and, you know, own what's happened, because, you know, they'll take it as a personal attack. But of course, it's no one's, everyone of this generation has a chance, or the new generations have a chance to right the wrongs that have been done in the past. I don't blame anyone who exists now for the white supremacy of slaveholders, you know, or the white supremacy of, you know, those who misplaced people in Australia, you know, or took over land, right? It's not, so that's why I think clean slates, we can really push forward on that aspect. But now I'm just preaching at this point.
Well, it has to hurt. I mean, there's always a level of discomfort. I mean, we have to be on that path towards racial justice, and I'm not there, and I don't know many white people who are really there. Maybe I don't know anyone who's, but we have to be on the way, and we have to get started. And I mean, gets a bit, you know, emotional, but, you know, when I work with the Muslim community, at some point I also realized, well, you know, I can't go do this kind of research anymore because I'm not Muslim. So there's always, we are limited by what we are, and we have to accept that our discomfort is nothing compared to the generational discomfort that other groups have experienced, and we shouldn't whinge about that. I mean, discomfort is something that can be quite powerful, and can give me personally quite some strength. I mean, I'm German. I grew up with, you know, what it means to have collective, not guilt, but collective responsibility for something that happened in our grandparents' generation. So I grew up with this idea that there's a difference between blaming me for something that happened 50 years ago, back then when I was a child. Now it's longer. But at the same time, not rejecting collective responsibility. And that's that. But balancing that is not always easy, but it's actually quite liberating when you get there.
I think, yeah, that's an excellent point, and I don't want to take it too much longer. I know it's late, but I will say just one point on the Germany aspect. I think that Germany's done an incredible job. You know, I think they're a model of reckoning with your past in a way that America simply has not done yet. And not, you know, like we have Confederate statues. You don't have, Germans do not have any Nazi statues. You know what I mean? Because the Confederates are the Nazis to the Black Americans. So, you know, it's one of those things where the way you've reckoned with that past, and the way there's been this, you know, coming to terms with that past, is really an important part of this counter-radicalization community approach. And you've really been able to hold two thoughts at the same time. Like, this happened, but we're better now because we recognize that this happened.
Yeah, exactly. And Australia is also struggling with that, to bring it back to Australia. And we can only mature as a country once we do that, and then we can move on. Otherwise, we will never. And to come back to the right-wing extremism issue, we can't fix the white supremacy narrative unless we address those historical injustices and the root causes that sit underneath all of this. So it is a longer conversation. So when you ask me about the intervention and prevention, and I think all of this plays a role. This is big, and it has to be part of our thinking about who we are as a society.
100%. Well, this was an incredible conversation, super insightful. These are what, these are what we need to be discussing, and I really appreciate you coming today, Mario.
Thank you. That was very exciting for me too. I learned a lot, and it was really nice to talk to you.
Yeah, well, I'm going to see you on the panel again. We'll do a panel at the end of this time, and thank you, Mario, for coming. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in.